Hi, everybody. My name is Paul B.J. Ransbury, and I'm the CEO of Aviation Performance Solutions. It's my honor to be here today with a couple of our APS experts. We're going to talk today about a very interesting topic called the top 3 UPRT implementation mistakes. And I think it's going to be a fun discussion. In the 25 plus years that we've been doing this, we've seen many different ways of implementing UPRT, some that work, some that don't, and then some of them that aren't obviously issues that we're going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and bring in our speakers for today. And with me, I have our VP Training, Randy Brooks, and also our VP Flight Operations, Clark McNeese. And so let me just go ahead and start. I usually introduce Randy, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce Otter today. So Otter is a former military fighter pilot from the U.S. Navy. He left there after being in Desert Storm and Southern Watch to join a major air carrier in the United States and became a 737 Boeing captain. And he spent 3 years in the major air carriers and left there, gosh, 15 years ago. I think it's over 15 years ago, to join APS full-time as an upset prevention recovery training instructor. So he is very well known in the industry as an expert on UPRT. In fact, he was part of the ICAO Go team traveling around the world on the implementation of UPRT at the air carrier level. Over 5,000 hours of teaching upset prevention and recovery training in our piston airplanes, jet airplanes. He actually helped stand up our European location, went to our military location in Alabama. So it was just not only a master or jack of all trades, but a master of all trades as well. So welcome, Otter. Why don't you have a few comments, then introduce Randy for us?
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's great to do this again. Certainly a passion of mine, and looking forward to this discussion because I think it's important. Let me introduce a great friend of mine and a good longtime colleague with the same passion. There's probably one person I know that's equally passionate about this topic. That's Randy Brooks. Started flying when he was very young and got into aerobatics, corporate flying at air shows. In fact, he's in the Air Show Hall of Fame. Ran the Red Baron Air Show team, but he is really began to, shall we say, develop the expertise when he took over Eclipse's UPRT program. What year was that, Randy?
Was that 2006 is when we ran it. 2006 to 2009, we had our L-39 out in Albuquerque.
Yeah, so he ran that operation for a number of years, and then we got to work together on the low-cart and some of the stall stick pusher group there, and helped co-author Advisory Circular 120-109. There. Anyway, it's great working with him day to day now because he's moved to Phoenix and his office is like right next door to me. So.
Well, thank you, Otter. I know both of you and I had the opportunity to fly earlier today. And in fact, I got to work with a couple of instructors that we were training, and we had to talk about some of the things that we're going to be addressing in this presentation. So thank you.
Awesome. All right, guys. So I just want to make sure that we mention our moderator out there is Carrie Bryson is joining us from Texas. She's going to be out on the LinkedIn channel. She'll be helping to put into kind of documents or resources that we come up with that we want to share here today. So if you are watching on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, we'll try to look to your comments and questions, but we're primarily running on LinkedIn platform today. So we are simultaneously broadcasting on all of those. So let's go ahead and go back here to our slides with everybody, and let's go to the next one. So this is a pretty important topic that we have here today, the top 3 UPRT implementation mistakes. And we're going to be looking at it from a couple different angles. We're going to be looking at it from the provider of UPRT perspective, and then also the user of UPRT perspective, and the things that we have learned over the years. It's not do it the APS way. We're here to talk about what we've seen to help you make good choices, either as somebody looking into the industry to find UPRT for yourself or your flight department, or if you're looking at standing up a UPRT operation or you have one already, then hopefully if this doesn't resonate with you, then perhaps we're going to give you a heads up, some things here just into our discussion, because I can see that we've spent enough time getting our introductions done. We've gathered a good number of participants here today. So why don't we guys talk about the importance? So we're talking now about the provider. We're talking about the UPRT provider, whether that's an on-aircraft provider, a simulator provider, an academic provider, it really doesn't matter who it is and what area of upset prevention recovery training. These particular areas apply to all of them. So why don't we get started, Randy, by going to you on the importance of UPRT instructors and how that can be categorized as a mistake. Now, remember, we're using the word mistake in the kindest possible way to just, give you a heads up on an area that could be a self-defeating situation if you don't address it comprehensively. So why don't you talk to the UPRT instructor part, and then you can jump in there, Otter, whenever you're ready.
So there's two aspects, BJ. The first is the UPRT instructor. And so we have to understand that this is a different domain of experience than what we use in teaching in the normal envelope. So, most licensing training is what we would call prevention training. It's trying to stay in the envelope. In UPRT, we sort of pick up under the assumption that there has been an upset that we're teaching pilots to recover from. And so that requires both a different view in terms of the aerodynamic assumptions. But if we're talking about on-aircraft training, then it certainly means that the pilot needs to be fluent, being very comfortable in that all-attitude environment. And we have to understand that, and sometimes we get applications for people as instructors that have 5, 10,000 hours and more, and you look at it and you try and look for any mention of all attitude experience, and there's nothing there. And they must not understand that they have to have that all attitude domain experience to be able to teach. So I think that's one of the big misconceptions. Otter?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why the FAA will never say, all right, all you CFIs start teaching UPRT and aerobatic airplanes, because we start hurting a lot of people for sure in it. So it's critical to have this background and not only the training and expertise in it, but the ability to teach in this time critical area as well, because it takes some unique instructing skill sets for this. It's not just teaching pilots to intercept a localizer.
So I would add that in this area of the UPRT instructor, why does the instructor matter so much? Well, the instructor is the facilitator of what's positively transferable and what's potentially negative training or negative transfer of skill. And to be able to do that, they have to have the expertise, the background, typically operating in most domains of aviation, to be able to talk to those areas, have the credibility for the pilots they're training to listen to them, but also really to be able to find the opportunities of learning that transfer. And what we find when we, just for us from APS perspective, is we're looking for instructors with substantial all-attitude experience, substantial real-world jet experience, substantial instructor experience, because we know that's what it takes to be able to communicate in a way where you're giving skills and knowledge to pilots that can transfer to any fixed-wing airplane that they're going to fly in the industry. So I think the thing that I would add, then you guys can talk to it, is we look for the best raw materials we can get an instructor, and then it takes really quite a lot of intense training to qualify them as UPRT instructors. So with the right raw material and experience in place, it's much easier to train a UPRT instructor, because I would submit without the right kind of experience to start, it is very, very difficult to create or grow a UPRT instructor to be able to teach in certain domains of upset training. So why don't I pass that thought over to you, Randy, then Otter, then we'll move on to our next topic, because we know we have a lot to talk about today.
So we're going to talk about two different domains of instruction. On the all attitude side, we've already talked about the importance of being comfortable in that environment. And in the case of APS, we take 5 weeks to train a new instructor. And these are people that may have been, platform instructors in F-16s and other tactical aircraft. And that's the degree of training that we have to make sure that they know how to teach this material. Now, in a simulator, we have 2 pilots here with a major air carrier training with us this week. They're going to be with us the whole week. They're going to be flying on aircraft with us. They did 4 flights to understand the human factors. Now, that's the way to do it right, is they'll leave with simulator time as well. They'll be doing presentations with us. this Friday, and where we get a chance to supervise them and give them feedback. And so that is very, very different than okay, I read this book, I read the requirements of EASA, FCL 745.alpha, to make sure that, we don't transfer any negative training. But then there is a last piece, BJ, that whether we're talking about on-aircraft or simulator instructors, there needs to be a passion for what the subject matter entails, because this isn't the second or third cause of fatalities. It's number one, and we have a very, very real opportunity to affect change if we take it seriously and do it as well as we can.
Otter, over to you.
Yeah, you don't want the blind leading the blind, because it certainly perpetuates the problem that we have here. So you definitely have to have that instructor with a passion. You don't want you really can't afford to have a run-of-the-mill instructor just jump in, read a page or two on how to teach upsets. He's got to go through some fairly extensive training.
Yeah, and I would submit that the instructor is really the glue that makes everything else work, because we're going to talk about other dimensions that could be potential mistakes or weaknesses in programs. And without the instructor there that can take inventory of what's going on, how to extract positive training, to deal with many different personality types as well. So it really depends on the scope of the training. And I think to your point originally, Randy, was the fact that to take a typical CFI, to have them teach in an area where they don't have any experience whatsoever, is just a recipe for disaster. So we just need to be aware of that before we move on. Okay, guys, I'm looking at the time clicking by. And by the way, I just noticed we have people in from around the world. We have Argentina, we have Turkey, we have UAE, and of course we have folks here in North America. So it's truly a global audience that we have today. In fact, actually, David Pilkington, he didn't put where he's from, but I know that's Australia. Welcome, David. So good to see you. All right, over to training devices. I'm not even going to introduce that. Let's go over to you guys and talk about the importance of the type of training platform and some of the characteristics and how that could be a mistake by not choosing the right platform. Randy, why don't we, I'm not going to surprise you here. Let's start with the on-aircraft training platform selection and maybe start that conversation.
Sure. I think it helps to understand what kind of tool we need for the job, to understand what the job is that needs to be done. And in upset prevention recovery training, what we're trying to prepare pilots for is what they would need to know, understand, and practice outside of the normal envelope. Well, how in the heck are we safely going to prepare them for what to do outside of the normal envelope if we don't have an aircraft that can go there? So if we are using an aircraft that can't go safely with a margin of safety into the upset domain, then we can't accomplish the training that we're supposed to be accomplishing through UPRT. Right, Otter?
That's right. In fact, we can show, we have a great graph. We're not going to show it right now, but that shows that when you're training in a normal category airplane, going through flight training, you can only explore 11% of all attitudes that you could get in an airplane. That leaves virtually 90% of all attitudes that you could get in an airplane, and you can't even go there unless you get in an all attitude, all envelope capable airplane.
So Randy, let me ask you something, because you said something that somebody could argue. You said in the upset domain, and for example, they'd say, well, gosh, Randy, the upset domain, nose high upsets 25 degrees nose up, more than 45 degrees of bank, 10 degrees nose down, according to the Airplane Upset Recovery Training Aid Revision 2. So if I go to 30 nose up and 60 degrees of bank and 20 degrees nose down, I'm in the upset domain, I'm good. Do you see any perhaps failed logic in that approach to it?
I do. A couple of different things. One is that anybody that's been flight instructing for any period of time knows that their students may have a vote in the matter. And that just because they were trying to remain within the parameters that the aircraft is certified does not mean that you're going to stay there. The second part of that is the human factors part. And if we don't prepare a pilot to be functional, to be cognitively involved, despite the human factors that they're going to see if they go into a portion of the envelope that they've never visited before, then they aren't comprehensively trained. Then they haven't been imbued with the skills that we need to truly make them safe. So we're really just fooling ourselves and playing around with semantics if we go down that road, which we know that there are providers, certainly in Europe with the EASA requirements, that are working their way around. And, what we should be asking ourselves is, what do we really need to do to provide the pilots with the skills that they need to make a change in the loss of control and flight accident rates that we have now?
So it could be argued that, this recovery stuff, as long as you're good at awareness and prevention, whoever needs recovery, right? And that's generally the argument. But what we find is the fact that the value of going into developed upsets beyond 90 degrees and more extreme pitch attitudes, for example, builds a mental model, A, of how to get there, B, what it looks like, and C, what is the process to navigate back into the heart of the envelope. So, Otter, what would you add to that? Maybe to prompt you. It looks like you have something to say, but at the end of what your comment is, how transferable are the skills pre 90 degrees of bank compared to post 90 degrees of bank? So go to the point you're going to mention, Otter, then I'll remind you of that one.
Well, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that just because we're pushing for an all latitude, all envelope capable airplane like an aerobatic airplane does not mean that we need to go out and start doing aerobatics. That would not necessarily solve the issue as well. In fact, that's traditionally what upset training has been viewed as in a lot of on-aircraft providers, is really nothing but an aerobatics course. And I'd like to just mention that there's a big difference philosophically between doing aerobatics and upset training. For one, we need to understand an aerobatic maneuver is a planned precision maneuver, but an upset recovery is an unplanned, non-precision maneuver. So we have to approach that training differently as we work with pilots. Were you going to say something?
I just wanted to add, BJ, you kind of touched on prevention versus recovery. And I don't think that there's anybody that's listening to us right now, and certainly none of us on the call, that wouldn't prefer to prevent an upset rather than having to recover from it. What I think is missed by many in industry is that if you really like prevention, the best way to get it is to teach upset recovery skills. Because as you mentioned, developing that mental model and those pattern recognition skills means that you're actually less likely to use the fancy flying skills that you learn in upset recovery if you watch the escalation of a variety of upsets in order to learn how to recover from them. We think that pilots will, have much better prevention skills by virtue of that.
And it's much like falling off the edge of a cliff, right? If the edge of your cliff is 60 degrees of bank, the fear and startle and your emotions start escalating as you approach the area of the unknown. While we don't want to be there, the been there, seen that value, and the confidence and the competence that you have to deal with it is really immeasurable. The interesting, because next week we're going to have a discussion on the myths of UPRT, and one of the myths that we're going to be talking about, I don't want to get into it today, is the fact that you shouldn't be using aerobatic airplanes to teach in people how to fly non-aerobatic aircraft, and we're going to talk about that. The fact that the domain of the real threat, the fatal threat, lives outside the normal operation of the typical operation of pilots, which means we have to take them where they haven't been before. So by necessity, what they need is where they don't want to go. And so it's an important concept in that respect. Okay, guys, how are we doing on training devices? Anything else to say? Did you want to talk to simulation or virtual reality at all, guys, in any way?
I would just like to say that this touches on our previous topic, which is the instructor, because a regular unenhanced level D simulator, level C or level D simulator, can be a very, very effective tool. Obviously, it's not going to have the full range of aerodynamics that we can experience in flight, nor is it going to provide all of the human factors aspects that pilot would get in an actual airplane. But if the instructor knows how to use the simulator properly within the valid training envelope of that device, there's a lot of good training that can be achieved there as well.
Can I just throw in, because it is a mistake that I see regularly out there, and that is training departments using their simulators inappropriately, especially beyond critical angle attack.
Yeah.
They're letting pilots go to full aerodynamic stalls. They're even teaching spins in simulators if the airplane will spin, and it's just grave negative training because 99.9% of the simulators out there do not have accurate aerodynamic modeling beyond critical angle of attack. Now, the Part 121 carriers are required to have some of their simulators with the enhanced stall model that has been validated, but the vast majority of simulators are only good for approach to stalls.
And there's even then, when they have a certain number of degrees beyond CL max otter, there's very limited beta integration of the fidelity of that model as well. So just a huge amount of caution out there. Using your device within its validated training envelope was very, very important. Okay, guys, anything on VR, Randy, you want to mention here? Or do you want to move on?
Well, VR, I think, is a new topic that if folks haven't seen it, there's some pretty magical capabilities out there. And it's giving us a new tool that's low cost that we know here at APS is allowing us to emulate a broad range of cockpits and operational capabilities. We could never afford to have all of the simulators that, we've got dozens, I think now, of various cockpit models that we can use, but that's really only useful if the pilot has had on-aircraft training previously, because if they haven't, then they're not going to get those human factors benefits and the full aerodynamic complement of information they have on aircraft. But it is a good adjunct to on-aircraft training.
So maybe before we move off this, I just point to the ICAO manual on upset prevention and recovery training that recommends all attitude airplanes. This just is an APS. It also recommends simulation and non-type specific simulation and type specific simulation. So the wonderful thing about the ICAO manual on UPRT, while it can be interpreted in many different ways, and we're seeing some unfortunate interpretations around the world, it also is setting up the structure for the industry of a paradigm shift in its approach to overcoming the threat of loss of control. So with that official reference, why don't we move on to intensity of training? And I know you guys know I put a slide in on a graph here. Let's just hold back on that. And let's just talk generally about, first off, Randy, or maybe Otter, what's intensity of training mean? I think that's a topic we should explain before we get into the details of what it is and what it isn't.
Well, it's really referring to the depth and amount and focus that has to go into the training, because in order to develop this resilience, this ingrained DNA and restructure the DNA of the pilot so that he is able to address and recall these skill sets in a time-critical, life-threatening upset, and not just a few upsets, but literally an infinite variety. There has to be a certain level of intensity. And I think we can all relate to what this means when you're trying to learn a new skill. When you have a certain amount of focus for a certain period of time, you get it quicker, as opposed to sporadic and chopped up. And so we're going to show a graph here in a minute that will show what we have learned and experienced as valuable, and it shows the type of intensity that you need.
So I think there's two ways that we can describe intensity. One, and let's be clear that intensity is not a commonly used term that everybody understands what it means. The first way is sort of the density of training. That is, how many flights are you going to have and in what period of time? Because we would all agree that 4 flights in a period of 3 days is going to be a lot more impactful than 4 flights spread over 3 months. You're not going to have the retention and the reinforcement that you would have. But the other goes to the intensity of the experience itself. And we touched on this when we talked about going beyond 90 degrees of bank. And that's because we as an industry often forget the amount of cognitive impairment that can take place when a pilot is surprised or startled, as in an unexpected upset event. We do unusual attitude training in a simulator and we go, well, why was that so hard? Well, it wasn't, because it was a simulated Earth that was coming up at you. But you try that on a dark and stormy night when you are expecting something normal and you have a systems failure or an environmental problem that leads you into an upset, you better have dealt with that level of intensity in your training, or you're not going to be able to apply your training when it's needed to save your life.
So I would add that, first off, I agree with everything that's been said. A big part of repetition to proficiency and upset training, done well, done properly in the right environment, is not just skill development. It's by far the easiest thing to teach in upset prevention recovery training is what to do and how to do it. The most difficult part is developing the mental discipline to access these skills in a crisis, to have them embedded into a core skill set. So I think what we're talking about here in the common mistake is that a program generally won't have enough intensity, enough training over a short period of time, not enough time for repetition to proficiency, and certainly not spread out too far within the program. I know that there's generally a big push to try to find areas of efficiency within a program, especially at flight schools. Let's do the first UPRT flight on the first week. Let's do the second one at the end of the fifth week. Let's do 2 at the end. While that fits into the typical training pattern, we need to remember that the reason that loss of control in flight is the #1 threat to air safety is because it's a result of how we classically train pilots. So we need to understand that the density intensity of training is a transformational concept for flight schools trying to implement UPRT solutions. So before we go to our graph, guys, anything else on that?
Well, I'd just like to say that everybody's probably heard the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that gets to just what you were saying, BJ, that if we don't change how we are doing business, we are not going to change the result, which we very much should want to change. It's the leading killer in aviation.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got people joining from Brazil and Mexico now, so that's wonderful. Welcome, everybody. Great to have everybody here. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our graph, because I think this is going to be something that's very interesting here. So this is, we're going to mention EPIC S2 is a APS concept we'll get to later. It really is talking about the concept we're discussing here of intensity of training, but this graph is really informative, and this is a general principle or concept that we see demonstrated day after day, week after week, year after year with pilots from general aviation to business to corporate to airline to military. It's just something for training providers to be aware of, because there's a very, very strong push to reduce the number of flights, to reduce the amount of training, and we just want to share with you that it's not only the course content or the program content, but it's the number of flights and over how many days makes a big difference as well. If you're truly seeking to mitigate the threat of loss of control in flight, and you're not just simply driven to try to put an X on the board to say that UPRT has been done, if you're trying to save lives, this graph is going to be extremely informative to you. And unfortunately, for the program managers, it may not tell them what they want to hear, but the reality is what we've seen over 25 years. So let's get started. So the first one on the left side is what it talks about there is the maximum competency of a pilot. Now, where it says no UPRT, we did an investigation of 135 pilots in 2007 and 2008, where we provided them information, academic training, and the fact that they were going to be tested, what the right thing to do was in an airplane upset. We took them up in an airplane, we gave them a chance to get proficient, and then we surprised them with a startling event of an airplane upset to see how they handled it. We weren't looking for any particular technique. We weren't looking for any particular method of doing it. Just simply they recovered the airplane within the typical capabilities of a normal category aircraft. And what we found is that their competency rate, depending on where they came from, was somewhere between about 20 and 40%. In other words, it was more likely that they would not survive than they would had they not had proper training. So we averaged it out here for 30%. So unprepared, facing a startling airplane upset, the general inventory of pilots around the world will have about a 30% success rate, and that's pretty much recovering by accident is what it comes out to if you consider all the attitudes and conditions. Now, interestingly enough, go ahead and take a look at that first one. They have one UPRT flight. There is substantial increase. There's an improvement from a single flight, and that's very, very interesting. Awareness occurs. They get habituated to the environment. They recognize that there's a domain out there they don't understand. They're more cautious, and there's real benefit. Now, the conundrum is this. we would expect the curve to have a gradient that would continue up equally over time. But what we're finding is the second flight is actually a regression in capability, and is due to something called sensitization. And remember, this isn't a program that we feel is done optimally. What we find is the pilots on the second flight are now verifying their fears. They're essentially in situations that they were apprehensive of. They're now put in a situation where they're expected to recover. Confidence is reduced. They're overwhelmed by the situation. If they quit after second flight, they're actually worse off than they were by doing no UPRT at all. Now, we start seeing a rapid gradient, and this is in 95% of the cases. We see now on the third flight a rapid increase where they're now being habituated. They're now starting to get confident in what they're doing. They're starting having the ability of understanding what's going on in the counterintuitive environment. And now they're starting to generate capability. Then the fourth flight, they're back on track. So this is not a linear learning process that we see in upset prevention and recovery training, because they're in an environment they've never seen before, with the airplanes handling very differently in situations where their traditional skill sets not only don't work, but can be the very wrong thing to do in an airplane upset event. So what we find, if we continue beyond fourth flight, you'll start seeing those other dotted lines below the green one are the atrophy after years away. How much do their skill sets fade in 5 years, 2 years, and 1 year? And this is based on direct evidence from APS. So what's happening in UPRT? No UPRT, there's no change. There's an increase due to awareness and habituation in the first flight. There's essentially a regression due to sensitization. Their fears have been validated, and they're actually more sensitive to it than they were before. Then they start gaining capability through continued habituation, extinction of fear, and then they ultimately get to a condition of overlearning and reappraisal, which are now actually going to counterintuitive methods that they wouldn't have thought of immediately when they first started the training program. So Randy, that's a big mouthful for me to get out there. Most important is the shape of the curve. Do you guys want to talk to that and to just maybe discuss how you see that, or if you don't say that as well, but just share with people the kind of the conundrum of UPRT in this unexpected learning process?
So there's a couple of ways to look at it. For most people that are listening to you, BJ, they're going, that doesn't make any sense. How could two be worse than one? And I think most of the pilots listening, if you go back to when you were learning to fly and you remember you had a good day and then you had a bad day, right? That roller coaster of the learning curve where you go, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get this. Okay. So that's an example that we see of that up and down. As an instructor, I'll give you a funny story. Shortly after I started here at APS, I'm working with a student and I saw this. We did one flight, we did the second flight, and it's like, oh my gosh, I only got 2 more flights to figure this out. And this kid is not figuring it out. And what am I going to do? And I went to BJ and he just said, hang in there, don't worry. And sure enough, the structure of the program is almost magic in that they ended up getting the skills that they needed before they left. But it was, partly just based on this curve that they needed a fair amount of practice to get there. But let me go back to a point that I made earlier. Why are we doing this? We're doing this not just because it's fun training or because we like to fly upside down. We're doing this to try and potentially save our lives and the lives of our passengers someday. And so even though you might learn something in 1 or 2 flights, have you learned it well enough to actually use it in an emergency? And what we've seen here at APS is that no, you can't until 3 or 4 flights, the 4th flight really bringing the amount of retention that you want to be able to do it on demand whenever it's necessary. Otter?
Yeah. Maybe, Otter, before you insert, I'd just like to clarify that this model is for on-aircraft upset training when you have the psychophysiological challenges of dealing with the real-world environment causing that regression. And simulator-only training is more of a traditional consistent gradient of improvement because they're not dealing with the human factor dimensions of it. Sorry, Otter, didn't mean to step on you there. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, we do our 4 flights. If a customer is going to do our, professional pilot training program where it's 4 flights in the aerobatic airplane, we do it over 2.5 days. And what's interesting is they'll get their first 3 flights done at the end of the 2nd day. And what's fascinating is, and what this graph is trying to say, is that when they come back for that fourth flight, the morning of the third day, there is something magical that has happened to them internally. And it's after sleeping on it, it's after just thinking about it. And again, that repetition and proficiency, that intensity they've had, they're not just 25% better than they were the day before. They're like 10 times better. They are just so much more resilient and confident in their skill sets.
So I would add that the training providers out of there, we've identified this as a mistake of providers. So we're encouraging you to fight for the required amount of training to accomplish the learning to mitigate the threat, not to fill the X on the X board to say UPRT was done. We have programs that we've implemented at other locations have the exact same program content, but forced into 3 flights. Dramatic difference in the outcome of the graduates simply by not having enough intensity over enough number of days, but not too many days. And so it does matter. So again, for those providers that are trying to make a difference, to try to improve safety, continue to fight with your management, or maybe not fight, to negotiate with your management to try to get the training required built into the program. Find the efficiencies within your training program to be able to overcome the costs of this, because it is addressing the number one threat to air safety. A full 50% of people dying in aviation accidents are due to losing control of the airplane. Okay, guys, I know our time is being eaten up. This was more about providers. Let's, the last box there is just talking about expanded training gives more depth of expansion and transfer of skill, which we're not going to get into today. Okay, so guys, now this is now the UPRT users' mistakes. And again, please don't take the word mistake as a critique or a negative. We're just trying to telegraph what we've seen of flight departments, of airlines, of individual pilots making the very best decisions they can based on their experience to get the best training they can, given a certain budget and time. We're simply presenting to you some of the areas to watch out for, which could have a negative unintended consequence on the capability you think that you have, but in reality, you don't. So I've been transmitting a lot here. Let's jump to you, Randy. Why don't you talk about, for those people, those users coming in to say they only do just on-aircraft training, they only do just simulator training, they only do just academic training, kind of the one solution or the one intervention is the solution. Do you want to talk to that just for a minute?
Yeah, so let's say you have an aerobatic aircraft and you say, I don't like charts and graphs, and I'm just gonna teach everybody what they need to know in the airplane. Well, you know, we know that the cockpit is not a very good classroom in some cases. In some cases, it's the best classroom. But we know that there's a lot of academic understanding that will help us to understand what it is that we need to do in the airplane. And we know that the aerodynamics work significantly different in the upset domain, which a lot of folks, most pilots, are not familiar with. So it's best, because it's a lot cheaper to provide academic training than to be running around in the airplane, to utilize academics so that we leverage the use of the airplane for maximum benefit when we have the opportunity to get there. We've already talked about the human factors benefit of the aircraft that we get. But you know what? If we're talking about using an all-attitude capable aircraft, it's generally going to have a different configuration than what we're going to see in an operational aircraft, like a side-by-side cockpit. And so in those instances, using the simulator helps to have an environment that's closer to the real world, heavier control forces, a roof over your head, higher control forces. But it also allows us to look at CRM, and it allows us to go some places that would be crazy to go in the aircraft, like low altitude or working at night or in the weather. Those are the things where the simulator can enhance it. And I'm proud to say that APS really pioneered this integrated concept, which has been accepted by ICAO, accepted by IATA, because it maximizes the benefits of each of these components and covers up their deficiencies.
Yeah, I will just say, you know, I remember when, you know, we were very much just an on-aircraft and academic UPRT provider for many years. And then when we decided to get into simulators and figure out how to integrate simulation the best way, I remember when pilots would come through and we would put them through their on-aircraft training, and then we'd go get the simulator. And one of the great things about a simulator is be able to put it in the middle of an upset and then freeze it. You can't freeze an airplane, when you're out there, and you freeze it, and you just say, hey, just look around, and I'll never forget their faces. They're like, wow. I mean, nobody had ever done that for them. Nobody had ever put them in these abnormal latitudes and all that, and just let them absorb everything that's potentially going on here, and the instrumentation and all that. So the simulators are such a great tool to integrate with the on-aircraft.
So I would add that if you're a single engine piston operator, then on-aircraft training may be sufficient for you. It may be hitting the most critical areas. With that said, there's still value, as Randy talked about, getting into simulation, even as a single engine piston operator, to be able to see true instrument recovery in the sim, very low altitude upsets. And so there's dimensions that add value. But I think the more important message we have here with a single platform, if you're a multi-engine high-performance jet pilot and you're going out and getting piston-only upset prevention and recovery training, it's going to give you some skill sets that are transferable. But there is a significant amount of training and insights available to you that the simulator is offering that you are just simply missing. There are gaps in your protection. Now, on the other side of it, simulator-only training, and maybe this is something we can talk about. I'll bring our slides back up here. Simulator-only training, the other side of what Otter was talking about when we took the people on aircraft training and put them in the sim, in that same test, we actually trained simulator-only pilots with the same academics, the same intensity of training, the same skills, same discipline, same call-outs, and then put them in the real airplane. Even though they had the same knowledge, insight, skills, and disciplines, they were psychophysiologically incapacitated to take action in the real airplane due to startle and fear. So you will see that while there's value in simulation, it misses the human factors. And I can tell you right now, like I said before, the easiest thing to teach is what to do and how to do it. A simulator is great for that. Getting access to those skill sets in a crisis, being resilient, that comes from the training, the human factor, immersion from on-aircraft training. So you can see that we're not saying all on-aircraft training. We do that. We're not saying all simulator training. We do that too. What we're seeing is if you're looking for a single platform to mitigate your threat, except in a very small cross-section of the aviation community, which would be, for example, single-engine piston operators, you're probably leaving a big gap in your protection. So Randy and Otter, final comments before we go to the underappreciation of integration?
Well, I just think that people see the way that we are talking about a lot of interlocking circles here, because again, it goes back to the instructor. We've talked about that. We've talked about the various components. So no, nothing further.
Well, I want to bring a comment. I'm just going to put a comment into the stream here, guys. It's very interesting. It's from Patrick. It's on our previous topic about intensity to training. He said, interesting sideline. Skiers try to learn to snowboarding for the first time, typically get it on day 3, but are terrible up until that point. I think that's an interesting. So we're not just talking about UPRT, anything that is very different. Go ahead, Otter.
That was me. I think it was day 4 for me.
Otter needed some remedial training. Okay, let me introduce underappreciation of integration, because it sounds very much like the first one. The underappreciation of integration is what we call overlay training, which is the transferable elements from academic to on-aircraft, from on-aircraft piston to on-aircraft jet, from on-aircraft in general to simulation, non-type specific, type specific, and then VR. Now, here's the thing that we're getting at. There's the underappreciation of integration because you need to have the common expertise of the instructor gluing all that together to ensure the information is transferable, that it's positively reinforcing. And when you can do that, you truly have magic happening that we've talked about. So the proper integration of UPRT in a number of different domains, such as academic, on-aircraft, and simulation, is tremendously valuable, but you have to have the integrity of the program, of the instructor, the teaching method. So to go somewhere for on-aircraft training and somewhere else for simulator training, unless they've really synced up and got their story straight, that can be actually lead you astray and generate negative training. So talk about, guys, we already put, I think, the single platform to bed. Talk about the value and appreciation of integration for a few minutes.
Boy, BJ, one of the, for one thing, the reason it's underappreciated is because there's very, very few people doing it. We know that in the aviation community, there are training centers that use simulators and there are on-aircraft training providers that use the aircraft. There's not a lot of places that are using both. But if they are using both, then one of the essential pieces is that the instructors need to have that common knowledge base. Otter mentioned the program that I ran for Eclipse prior to coming to APS. And one of the rules that I had was that any of the academic instructors had to be qualified in the aircraft, and any of the aircraft instructors had to be qualified to give the academics. And that was to make sure that they were talking about the same things the same way, because it's very easy to use different terminology. So without that, you're not reinforcing the message, you're just confusing the student. And the worst case is, and we've seen this numerous times, is that they're learning how to do things one way at one training provider, and the other training provider isn't teaching an entirely different way. So that's certainly not reinforcing.
Otter?
Yeah, it's the goal of integration, again, is to maximize the benefits of each platform, and then to minimize the limitations of that platform as well by going to another platform that has benefits that overcomes those previous limitations. So as you follow this path of integration, you're ultimately trying to come back full circle. You're ultimately trying to come back to the pilot's platform that he's in. You don't want him just to end his training at an aerobatic airplane or even a non-type specific simulator. Ultimately, you need him to understand how to transfer all this knowledge and skill to his platform that he is flying in day to day.
And I think VR opens the door to doing that, which we're seeing, which is an exciting next generation of capability. The one thing I will say as well is that you can have integration but lose effectiveness by displacing them in time. So for example, the value of having a program over a fixed number of days or a short number of days, 2 or 3 or 4, even 5 days, is the people going into the simulator, for example, have recency of experience in loading, unloading, motion queuing that can transfer into the simulator. Just a week or two later, or certainly a month or more, if they're doing on-aircraft training in one location, then going somewhere else to do simulation, while there is value if the instructors are synced up and the program is aligned, you are missing a huge opportunity in the transfer of knowledge, awareness, and recency of experience by doing that. So the very, very best way is an intense program that integrates the entire overlay experience of integration. So the users out there looking for solutions, certainly, budgets drive decisions, location drives decisions. But if you're looking at mitigating the threat comprehensively, you need to find a provider that does an integrated approach, or you're leaving a lot on the table unnecessarily. And this isn't expensive. It's not about expense. It's about quality and training value and mitigating the threat, not filling the square. Okay, guys, last item here, looking at 48. I think we're trying to wrap up in an hour. Being overly influenced by 1 or 2 unique features. And after this, we're going to show the Epic S2 diagram, which is kind of mysterious, probably, that people have never heard it. But this particular one is, let's say that people are attracted to some particular type of airplane, or one particular person that they want to go train with, or they want to have, you know what I'm getting at? What's the? It's a bit of a red herring, and what do we mean by being overly influenced by 1 or 2 unique features? Randy, do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Sure. Hey, there's a lot of fun airplanes out there that I'd like to go fly, and there's a lot of fun people that I'd like to fly with. But what's the point here? What are we trying to do with our UPRT? If what we're trying to do is really get the skills that we need, no kidding, to save our lives, then there are better choices to make than what aircraft that is being used, unless we're making sure that we have the right platform. What we should really be looking for is the course, the program, the operator, the training provider that has the most sophisticated, robust air program that's going to provide pilots with resilient skills. That's what gives you more bang for the buck in the long run, is whatever you spend, don't just look at those raw dollars, look at what those raw dollars are going to buy you. And a cheaper program that doesn't end up giving you the skills that you need when you need them is not saving you money. It could be costing you your life.
Otter?
Yeah, there's definitely some temptations out there, I think, in the industry that are being disguised as upset training, but they're really one-offs. And heck, I'd love to go fly a World War II fighter in my quote upset training if I had to, or something. But we really do want to ensure that we're not going to, for one, waste our money, but two, worse yet, get negative training. So we really need to look into the program itself and the effectiveness.
Well, let me sharpen the point a little bit, is that if the pilots on this call are going to get into an accident in their career, there's a 50% likelihood it's loss of control in flight. And you want to make sure that you have the skills to overcome that. If you want to go on a boondoggle to fly a certain airplane or do a certain thing or fly with a certain person, do it. But make sure that you're getting the program to give you the skills you need to keep your family safe, yourself safe, and the passengers you fly with safe. Okay, guys, let's move. Oh, by the way, I see a question on a rotary wing UPRT. So if Carrie is out there listening, Carrie, could you, for J Power, could you post the link to the helicopter UPRT article that we wrote so we can just continue here as we're running out of time? So I don't know your first name there, J Power, but we're going to put a link into the chat stream there for you on rotary wing upset training. Okay, guys, let's go to the Epic S2. Now, this is kind of the follow-on, and we're not going to dive into this at all. This is an entire other discussion on it, but you'll see now a lot of the things that we talked about. The Epic S2 is the Every Pilot in Control solution standard. And what it's saying is, on that previous point about don't get overly influenced by one or two particular things, you really need all of these areas optimized to truly have skills that are going to resonate with you. So what these are, they know how to integrate them, and they know that they matter. And you'll notice there's 6 items, not just 5. There's the elite instructors, integrated program, intensity of training, best practices, purpose-built platforms. We've talked about a lot of these, but the big ring on the outside, initial training. The initial training has to be intense. It has to be effective. It needs to be comprehensive and integrated, but it's not a one and done process. It's not about doing this once and you're protected forever. Recurrent training is important, whether you do it every year like our military customers, you do it every 5 years like some of ours do. Most of them do it every 2 to 3 years. Recurrent training can be done, and if the initial training is done well, recurrent training can be done with very little cost in a very short period of time to top you up to your equivalent level of skills after initial training or higher. And so let's just open up the topic of Epic S2 in general, guys, to discuss as we wrap up our time. And I'm just going to put the URL up. If people want to go to our website and learn more about this, they can. But just, Randy, what are your thoughts on Epic S2? What would you share?
Well, the biggest thing about Epic S2 is it's applying things that we do normally for other parts of flight training. We know that instructors should be qualified. That's why we qualify instructors as multi-engine instructors, as instrument instructors, as glider instructors. We're just saying that, you should have training in that expertise of UPRT, using best practices, the whole concept of initial and recurrent training. These are not new concepts. They're just new when they are applied to UPRT, which unfortunately is just applied often as a veneer that looks good, but it isn't using all of the things that we know make flight training powerful.
Otter.
Yeah, I will add that there is some outstanding guidance now out there. When we talk about best practices, they're from a number of organizations, not just ICAO, even the FAA, IATA. IATA's got a great manual on upset training, guidance material and best practices. And a lot of training organizations are completely unaware of it. So please, we want to encourage you to look at those because it'll help formulate and structure a mindset on how a good UPRT program should look.
Love it, guys. Okay. Well, we're getting near to the end, folks. We'll be here just a few more minutes discussing. If you have any questions, please post them into the channel. We're doing our best to monitor. We've had mostly them comments coming in on LinkedIn. Please feel free to post it. Remember, Carrie will go ahead and put up a link to our forum. If you have any questions from today's event, or if you're watching the recording and you get to this point and you have a question, Carrie's going to put a link in there where you can click on that and just submit your question to us. And we'll have somebody appropriate to that question reach out to you and speak to you offline. So please go ahead and do that. So the topic of today's discussion, guys, was the top 3 mistakes of providers of UPRT and users of UPRT. What are your final comments on the providers of UPRT? And then we'll wrap up with the users. For providers, Randy, what would you urge them? What were your comments that you would share with them if you have their attention right now?
You know, we aren't talking about the second or third cause of fatalities here. We're talking about the number 1 cause of fatalities, loss of control in flight in every sector of aviation all throughout the world. So let's do a service to our fellow pilots of not just going through the motions and saying we have UPRT. We've given a lot of examples today of how UPRT can be done better. Let's do our best to try and make a difference and improve aviation safety for everybody.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll just second that. If you're a training provider, don't waste your time just going through the motions, trying to fill a block. Make a difference. I mean, that's why you're in training. You're in the business of making a difference in people's lives. In this case, pilots, and saving lives. So, do it the right way.
There's so much downward pressure, especially in Europe right now. It's a commodity marketplace. It's largely a competition between low-cost operators who can do it cheaper, who can do it minimum with the least qualified instructors, with the least pay to support them, to provide a program to fill an X. As a provider, please, the ethical commitment you have to improving safety, please do your best. Obviously, if you're in an influential position, get the program you need to stand out in the crowd. But if you don't, continue to share this thought, because it can be long suffering, right? Get the word out, continue to carry the torch of UPRT. So a couple of questions here, guys, before we go to the users. What Caesar has, let me just bring it into the chat. Looks like this is coming from YouTube. Let me see if I can bring it in here. What do you think about training organizations that are producing instructors without the required experience?
Well,
Randy?
I would say that, there's 2 reasons that they're doing it. And one is innocent and the other is a little more nefarious. The innocent one is that they just simply may not understand the threat to losing an aircraft, losing a life that is posed by instructors that are not sufficiently qualified. And even if it's in a simulator, there can be incorrect information that plants seeds that could cause problems way down the road. The other is simply that their priorities are confused, to put it generously, that they think that saving a few dollars, saving a little bit of time is more important than trying to save lives.
And I would say that the instructors don't know what they don't know. They have the best of intentions. They're introducing potentially catastrophic methods and not even knowing it, unfortunately. Otter, we have just a minute left. Any final comments?
No final thoughts on that. Just that a lot of people say they're about quality, but when it comes down to the brass tacks, it's really just about the money.
We hear all the time from organizations say we have the best flight training program in the world. We have the best training program for our flight department, for our airline. But at the end of the day, what it boils down to, understandably, we get it. It's not necessarily quality. It's cost and minimum impact on the training footprint. Last question to bring up, guys. I know we just have just a minute and 20 seconds, again, by Caesar. Any advice for organizations or pilots looking to find a UPRT provider? Let me just quickly chime in. We do, I believe, in the top of our website actually have a buyer's guide that's not just about APS. It's an opportunity to compare providers. We are not trying to create a monopoly in UPRT. We want this training to be happening around the world, and we do our best to be placed around the world. North America in several locations, Europe, and now going into Asia. But please have the opportunity of looking into really the content we've talked about today. Randy, for the users of UPRT out there, I think, which is kind of a good lead into Caesar's question in our last 40 seconds.
Just the fact that, we're offering ourselves as a resource. That's why we're out here. We're trying to make ourselves accessible. If we haven't gotten to your question today, it doesn't mean that you can't contact us online. We'd like to help you out. So get a hold of us if we haven't answered your question.
In 18 seconds, Marco, good question. Yes. AP businesses, I would say that 80% of our business is in multi-engine high-performance jet and turboprop operators. So great question. Okay, with that, everybody, we are at the end. I'd like to thank everybody for their time today, and thank you for joining us. And we will see you next week on the myths associated with UPRT. Take care, everybody out there. We will see you again soon. Bye-bye.